The cold was merciless. 30 degrees below zero, rifles freezing in the hands of Marines, engines stalling, blood turning solid before it hit the ground. It was Korea, December 1950, the Chosin Reservoir. Tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers had poured across the border, surrounding the 1st Marine Division on all sides. Men huddled in foxholes, their breath hanging like smoke, their boots frozen stiff, their nerves stretched thin. They were exhausted, hungry, outnumbered at least 10-1. Most commanders would have spoken in whispers, worried about morale, worried about panic. Not Louis Burwell, Chesty Puller. He walked through the snow, chin up, chest out, the same way he had marched through jungles in Nicaragua and swamps in Guadalcanal. His men watched him, searching his face for fear, and found none. Just that gravelly voice, the kind that sounded like it had been soaked in whiskey and gunpowder. "We're surrounded. That simplifies our problem." In a single sentence, the panic lifted. They weren't trapped victims anymore. They were Marines, with enemies in every direction and opportunities everywhere they turned. That was Chesty's gift, to take hell itself and turn it into a battlefield his men could believe they could win. But how did a boy from the Virginia countryside become the man Marines still pray to at night in their boot camps? How did he rise to become the most decorated Marine in history? A living legend whose very name meant grit and fight. To understand Chesty Puller, you have to start long before Korea, before Guadalcanal, before the uniform. You have to start with a restless kid in rural Virginia, looking at the horizon and deciding that his life would be spent chasing war. Louis Burwell Puller was born in 1898 in a small Virginia town, far from the battlefields that would later define him. His father died when he was just a boy, leaving him in a house where work came before comfort, where toughness wasn't a choice but survival. He grew up surrounded by stories of the Civil War, legends of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. For young Louis, war wasn't an abstract idea in a dusty history book. It was a calling, a path to prove himself worthy of the giants he admired. He tried college for a short time, even enrolled at the Virginia Military Institute. But books and lectures weren't enough. The world outside was burning, and he could feel it in his bones. He wanted the smell of gunpowder, the test of combat, the life that separates men from boys. So he left his studies and went searching for the only classroom that mattered to him, the battlefield. When he joined the Marine Corps in 1918, the First World War was winding down. He trained, prepared, prayed to be sent to France. But the war ended before he could cross the ocean. For most men, that might have been relief. For Puller, it was disappointment. He had missed his chance to prove himself. But fate wasn't finished with him. The 1920s were a restless time for the Marines, sent to the so-called Banana Wars in Central America and the Caribbean. Small conflicts, guerrilla uprisings, dusty towns, and endless jungles, places where most Americans had never even heard of. That's where Puller found his war. In Nicaragua, he led tiny bands of Marines deep into jungles filled with rebels who knew every tree, every trail. He marched his men through swamps, across rivers, over ridges that seemed designed to break lesser men. The fighting was brutal. Ambushes in the night, sniper fire from the shadows, machetes, and rifles in hands that melted back into the villages after every clash. But Chesty had a way of turning fear into discipline. He would be the first man awake and the last to sleep. He carried the same pack as his Marines, marched the same miles, ate the same meager rations. His men followed him not because of his rank, but because he never asked them to do anything he wasn't already doing himself. One night, his patrol was attacked by overwhelming numbers. Tracers cut through the dark, the jungle exploding with fire. Some officers might have ordered retreat, pulled back to regroup. Puller didn't believe in retreat. He shouted orders above the chaos, moving up and down the line, bullets slamming into trees around him. His voice cut through the panic. "Hold your ground. Pour it on them, boys." By dawn, the rebels were gone, leaving silence and smoke. The Marines had held, and they had done it because Chesty Puller refused to give an inch. For this, he earned his first decorations, the seeds of a reputation that would one day become legend. But more important than medals was the loyalty he planted in the men under his command. They had seen him fight, bleed, and refuse to break. And once a Marine sees that in a leader, he will follow him anywhere. Years later, Marines in boot camp would whisper his name like a prayer. But in the 1920s, he was still just an ambitious officer, chasing war wherever it could be found. Nicaragua gave him his first taste of combat, but the world was preparing something larger, something far deadlier. Because soon, Chesty Puller would leave the jungles of Central America and find himself in a place whose name would forever be tied to the blood and memory of the U.S. Marine Corps, Guadalcanal. The Pacific in 1942 was a furnace. After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Empire stretched across half the ocean, and the United States was still reeling. Guadalcanal was the first major offensive, a brutal, muddy, disease-ridden island where survival was as much about resisting malaria and hunger as it was about bullets and bombs. Chesty Puller landed there with the 1st Marine Division, already scarred from his years in the jungles of Central America. But Guadalcanal was unlike anything he had ever seen. The heat pressed like a hand on the back of your neck. Jungle rot ate at boots and skin, and every night the Japanese crept close, probing the lines, testing the Marines' nerve. Puller walked the perimeter daily, mud caked to his uniform, checking foxholes, speaking with every Marine. He didn't talk like a distant officer. He knelt down in the mud, asked if their rifles were clean, if they had enough to eat, if they were ready. When a Marine looked into his eyes, he didn't see a man who sat behind a desk. He saw someone who would be standing right beside him when the shooting started. One night, the Japanese launched a massive assault, waves of soldiers charging through the jungle, with bayonets gleaming and voices screaming into the dark. The ground shook under the force of it, Marines firing until their barrels smoked, explosions tearing the night apart. Puller moved up and down the line, his voice hoarse but steady, barking orders, encouraging his men, refusing to yield an inch. The attack raged for hours, but the Marines held. When the sun finally rose, the jungle floor was littered with the cost of Japanese determination and American resolve. Puller's men had stood firm, not just because of training, but because of the man walking behind them, beside them, and sometimes in front of them. News of Guadalcanal reached home, and with it stories of the iron-willed officer named Chesty, a nickname given to him for his barrel chest and booming voice. To young Marines, the name became larger than life. To the enemy, it became a warning. But Guadalcanal was only the beginning. Puller would go on to fight across the Pacific, at Cape Gloucester, Peleliu, and beyond. Each battle carved deeper into his legend. At Cape Gloucester, under torrential rain and in knee-deep mud, he led his Marines against a fierce Japanese defense, earning yet another Navy Cross. At Peleliu, in what was considered one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history, he once again proved that his presence was often the line between order and collapse. What made Puller different wasn't just his courage under fire. It was his philosophy of leadership. He believed officers should eat last, sleep least, and always share the hardships of their men. He cursed, he barked, he demanded, but he never demanded more of his men than he gave himself. That's why when he shouted, "Follow me," every Marine knew he wasn't leading from the rear. He was charging ahead, daring them to keep up. By the end of World War II, Chesty Puller was no longer just an officer. He was a symbol. a flesh and blood embodiment of the Marine ethos, toughness, loyalty, and the refusal to surrender. He had earned multiple Navy crosses, but medals were just metal. What mattered was the unshakable faith his men had in him. And yet, destiny wasn't finished with him. Because a few years later, in the frozen mountains of Korea, Chesty Puller would face the ultimate test, not just of his tactics, not just of his courage, but of his ability to lead men through what many believed was certain death. The Second World War had made Chesty Puller a legend, but it was in Korea, years later, that his name was etched forever into the soul of the Marine Corps. It was December 1950, in the frozen mountains around the Chosin Reservoir. The cold was a weapon in itself, -30, sometimes worse. Frostbite chewed at fingers and toes, weapons jammed as oil froze, engines coughed and died. The Marines of the 1st Division weren't just fighting an enemy, they were fighting the very air they breathed. Then came the Chinese. Tens of thousands of soldiers pouring over ridges and down into valleys, surrounding the Americans on every side. The Marines were outnumbered more than 10-1. Panic could have swept through the ranks. It could have broken them before a shot was fired. But Chesty Puller didn't do panic. He strode through the snow, his breath fogging, his coat open against the biting wind. His Marines looked at him, desperate for something, and he gave it to them. That voice, deep and steady, cut through the frost. "We're surrounded. Good. Now we can shoot in any direction." In one sentence, the fear turned into defiance. His men laughed, not because it was funny, but because it reminded them who they were. They weren't trapped victims. They were Marines, and as long as Chesty Puller was on his feet, they were going to fight their way out. The battles around Chosin were a nightmare. Wave after wave of enemy soldiers, charging through the snow, bugles blaring in the night. The hillsides lit up with gunfire, explosions echoing across frozen lakes. Marines fought until their rifles overheated, then picked up the rifles of fallen comrades and kept firing. Medics worked barehanded, flesh freezing to the metal instruments. Puller was everywhere. He moved between units, steadying nerves, directing fire, making sure no position collapsed. He never flinched. Men swore that even in the darkest hours, you could hear him barking orders, demanding discipline, reminding everyone that the only way out was through. When supplies ran low, Puller drove his men to hold until airdrops came. When wounded piled up, he made sure they were carried out, never abandoned. His words became fuel. "Remember, Marines don't die. They just go to hell and regroup." The retreat from Chosin wasn't a retreat in the ordinary sense. It was a fighting withdrawal through miles of ice and enemy ambushes, every step bought with blood and grit. But under Puller's command, the 1st Marine Division didn't collapse. They broke through the encirclement, bringing their wounded, their dead, and their honor with them. For his leadership at Chosin, Chesty Puller earned yet another Navy Cross, one of 5 in his career, more than any other Marine in history. But medals were never the point. What mattered was that he had taken men staring into the abyss and turned them into a force that would not be broken. After Korea, Chesty's body finally began to give out. Decades of war had left their mark, and in 1955 he retired from active duty as a lieutenant general. But retirement didn't silence him. Recruits still shouted his name in boot camp chants. "Good night, Chesty, wherever you are." Drill instructors used his story to define what a Marine should be: tough, loyal, unyielding. Even in death, he remained more than a man. He became a myth, a figure every Marine carried with them. Because Chesty Puller was more than medals and battles. He was proof of something deeper, that leadership is not about comfort or safety or even survival. It's about standing taller when everyone else feels small. It's about taking fear and reshaping it into courage. Chesty once told his men, "Take me to the brig. I want to see the real Marines." It was half a joke, half a philosophy. He knew that real strength wasn't polished or pretty. It was raw. It was forged in mud, fire, and frost. And it was carried by ordinary men who refused to quit. That's why decades after his last battle, Marines still whisper his name before lights out, still smile when they remember his words. Because some leaders live in history books. But the greatest live forever in the hearts of the men they led. And when a Marine today faces the cold, the dark, or the feeling of being surrounded, he knows one thing. Chesty Puller has already been there, and he showed the way through.